I'm going to destroy your whole family. He hurled a crystal glass that shattered inches from my head. I casually stepped over the shards of a $20,000 vase, met his bloodshot eyes, and did not blink. That is a fascinating threat, I replied, keeping my voice completely deadpan. But since I grew up bouncing between foster homes as an orphaned ward of the state, you are going to have to find them first. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, meaning we no longer have the budget to operate. So we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and transition our operations entirely to Patreon. If you feel today's story is compelling, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon to hear even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voice actors, bringing the drama to life within a single narrative. You can join by scanning the QR code of our Patreon page currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's story, where you will step into the shoes of our protagonist, Riley Hicks. At Aegis Paradigm Consulting, we did not handle standard public relations. We did not write apologetic press releases for celebrities who got caught doing things they should not have been doing. We were the absolute last resort, the people a corporate board of directors called when their golden goose started laying radioactive eggs. My hourly rate was notoriously high, but the contract pushed across the mahogany table this morning was practically insulting in its sheer absurdity. $1 billion in unrestricted stock options, vesting entirely in exactly 1 year. The catch: I had to babysit a monster. His name was Sterling Vance, a 26-year-old Silicon Valley tech founder who had just been suspended by his own board of directors. Sterling was the kind of savant who could rewrite the architecture of artificial intelligence in his sleep. But in the waking world, he possessed the emotional regulation of a toddler on a sugar crash. He had a nasty habit of verbally eviscerating his employees, throwing office equipment at senior executives, and treating his professional life like an endless frat party funded by venture capital. The board was terrified he would tank the company before their upcoming initial public offering. My job was to tame him, make him presentable, or, if that failed, break him so thoroughly he would willingly surrender his voting rights. I stepped out of the private elevator and into his 42nd floor penthouse overlooking the San Francisco skyline. The air smelled of expensive scotch and raw panic. A minimalist Italian leather sofa was currently acting as a barricade for 3 trembling personal assistants. Sterling Vance was pacing the center of the room. He had the sharp, angular features of a runway model, ruined entirely by a feral, unhinged glare. He held a bronze sculpture of a horse in his hands, weighing it like a baseball, before he hurled it directly at a massive flat-screen television. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of black and silver, showering the hardwood floor with glass. "Get out!" Sterling screamed at the assistants, his voice cracking with rage. "All of you are completely useless. I pay you 7 figures collectively to make sure my life runs perfectly, and you cannot even get my daily schedule right." The assistants scrambled toward the service elevator like frightened mice. I stood my ground, my hands casually tucked into the pockets of my tailored suit. I did not flinch when the television crashed. I did not break eye contact when he finally noticed I was standing there in his foyer. Sterling slowly turned toward me. His chest was heaving. He looked me up and down, taking in my calm posture, and sneered. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, taking a heavy step forward. "Wait, let me guess. The board sent you? Another overpriced corporate babysitter coming to tell me how to run the company I built from the ground up." "Riley Hicks," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "Aegis Paradigm. And I am not here to tell you how to run your company. Sterling, I am here to tell you how to behave like a functional human being so the adults in the room can make you richer." His face flushed a deep, violent red. The sheer audacity of someone speaking to him without shaking in their designer boots clearly short-circuited his brain for a second. He marched right up to me, invading my personal space, towering over me with cold, aggressive intimidation. "Listen to me very carefully, Riley," he hissed, his breath reeking of premium alcohol. "I have more money than God. I own the politicians in this city. I own the judges. If you do not turn around and walk back into that elevator right now, I will ruin you. I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I will bankrupt your firm." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper. "I am going to destroy your whole family." I looked at the shattered glass on the floor near my shoes. Then, I looked up, meeting his bloodshot eyes without a single blink. "That is a fascinating threat," I replied, keeping my voice completely deadpan. "But since I grew up bouncing between foster homes as an orphaned ward of the state, you are going to have to find them first." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in his pampered, billionaire life, Sterling Vance was utterly speechless. I watched the realization wash over his arrogant face, his ultimate weapon. The threat of destroying a person's life and loved ones with his endless wealth was entirely useless against me. I was a ghost. I had no past, no attachments, and absolutely nothing to lose. Sterling took a slow step back, staring at me as if I were an alien species. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced briefly by something else: uncertainty, fear. He realized right then that all his money could not buy my submission. The board thought they had hired a crisis manager. Sterling thought he was fighting a corporate suit. Neither of them knew that they had just initiated a brutal psychological war, and I had every intention of walking away with $1 billion, leaving his massive ego in ruins. I did not leave the estate after our first encounter. Instead, I had my 2 matte black suitcases delivered directly to the guest house on the edge of his sprawling Silicon Valley compound. The guest house was a glass and steel structure that looked like a modern art museum, completely devoid of warmth, which suited my purposes perfectly. The next morning, exactly at 7 o'clock, I walked into his primary dining room while he was aggressively stirring a cup of single-origin espresso. I placed a single sheet of heavy cardstock on the table right next to his cup. He glared at the paper, then up at me. It contained exactly 3 sentences. Rule 1, no screaming. Rule 2, no treating human beings like inanimate objects. Rule 3, every demand, request, or instruction must be preceded or followed by the word please. Sterling let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He immediately pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his wealth manager on speakerphone. He paced the room, ordering the man on the other end to buy Aegis Paradigm Consulting outright for whatever astronomical price my boss wanted, simply so he could have the pleasure of firing me himself. It was a classic Sterling Vance maneuver, throwing an endless supply of money at an obstacle until the obstacle ceased to exist. But this particular wall was made of titanium. I stood perfectly still, watching him listen as his wealth manager frantically reviewed the corporate filings. Slowly, the arrogant smirk melted off Sterling's face, replaced by a pale, sickening realization. The contract I held was not just a standard agreement backed by a panicked board of directors. It was intrinsically tied to an ironclad trust established by his own late mother mere weeks before she passed away. She had foreseen his inevitable downward spiral and locked a lethal contingency clause into his founder shares. He could not buy my firm out. He could not fire me. And if I walked away citing his non-compliance, the trust would automatically trigger, stripping him of 51% of his voting rights and handing them over to a blind charity. I was entirely untouchable, and his own mother had engineered the cage. His reaction was exactly as I had modeled in my psychological profile of him: absolute, destructive fury. He swept his arm across the dining table, launching a massive ceramic bowl of fruit and his espresso cup into the air. The ceramic shattered violently against the marble floor, splattering dark coffee across the white stone. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply retrieved a tablet from my briefcase and tapped a single command. Across the compound, inside his private, temperature-controlled laboratory, the mainframes went completely silent. The glowing screens faded to black. I had worked with his chief technology officer the night before to reroute the administrative privileges of the company's core development servers directly to my encrypted device. Every time he raised his voice above a conversational decibel, every time he threw an object or insulted the staff, I severed his connection to his life's work. Sterling stood in the kitchen, paralyzed by the sudden alert pinging on his phone, notifying him that his root access had been denied. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I calmly informed him that he would regain access to the servers only when his heart rate dropped below 90 beats per minute, and he personally cleaned up the shattered ceramic and coffee from the floor. The war escalated over the next 2 weeks. For 48 hours, he refused to eat, staging a bizarre billionaire hunger strike while pacing his glass-walled living room like a caged leopard. When his starvation tactic failed to elicit a single ounce of sympathy from me, he resorted to breaking his own expensive patio furniture. In response, I locked him out of his servers for a full 24 hours. Driven to the edge of madness by his inability to code, he actually dialed 911. 2 local patrol cars pulled up to the gated entrance of the estate. Sterling confidently marched out, intending to have me arrested in handcuffs. Instead, I met the officers at the gate with a meticulously organized binder of legal documents, including a power of attorney, a residency mandate signed by a federal judge, and a mental health conservatorship warning, all courtesy of his mother's trust. The officers politely apologized to me, gave Sterling a stern verbal warning about the severe penalties for misusing emergency services, and drove away. He watched their taillights disappear, looking more thoroughly defeated than I had ever seen him. It was during this intense period of behavioral conditioning that I began to truly observe him. I watched him through the massive glass windows of the estate. I analyzed his patterns. I realized that Sterling was not a sociopath. A true monster acts with calculated, cold malice. Sterling acted out of chaotic panic. His breathtaking arrogance was nothing more than a desperately constructed armor. He was an isolated, misunderstood genius who had been surrounded by parasitic yes-men since he was 19 years old. People only wanted his money, his stock options, or his political influence. He was absolutely terrified of betrayal, so he pushed everyone away with extreme cruelty before they could get close enough to stab him in the back. Underneath the billion-dollar bravado, he was just a frightened, lonely boy trying to protect the only thing in the world he actually understood, which was the logic of his algorithms. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He had spent 3 agonizing days redesigning the baseline architecture for a revolutionary artificial intelligence processor. It was brilliant, flawless work, but he had been forced to save the files on an offline, partitioned drive that I currently controlled. He marched into my office in the guest house. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might splinter. He stood over my desk and demanded the decryption key. His tone was harsh, demanding, and utterly devoid of manners. I did not look up from my laptop. I did not speak. I simply raised my right index finger and tapped it against the single sheet of cardstock taped to the corner of my desk. Rule 3. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with years of unchecked, toxic ego colliding head-on with an immovable object. I could see the physical toll the internal battle was taking on his body. His pride was literally choking him. He stared down at me, his eyes burning with a chaotic mixture of deep resentment and a strange, grudging, newfound respect. He closed his eyes, took a long, shuddering breath, and swallowed his pride. "Give me the decryption key," he said, his voice trembling slightly, lacking its usual venom. He paused, exhaled sharply, and forced the final word out of his throat like a physical weight. "Please." I picked up the encrypted flash drive and handed it to him immediately. I offered no gloating remarks, no triumphant smiles, and no condescending lectures. I gave him a simple, professional nod of acknowledgement. He took the drive, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second, before he turned and walked back to his laboratory. The impenetrable glass cage around his ego had just cracked, and for the first time in his life, Sterling Vance had submitted to someone else's rules. Once the glass cage cracked, the real monsters stepped out of the shadows. My primary mandate was to observe, and in the quiet aftermath of Sterling's broken pride, I turned my attention away from the target and toward his shadow. Two fixtures remained inexplicably anchored to his chaotic orbit, presenting themselves as his only loyal allies in a storm of corporate mutiny. The first was Julian, the chief operating officer of the company. The second was Chloe, a lifestyle influencer with 10 million followers and a diamond engagement ring on her left hand that cost roughly $2.5 million. To the untrained eye, they were saints. I was not an untrained eye. I was a predator who recognized other predators. Julian was a masterclass in calculated subservience. He wore bespoke suits that cost $5,000 apiece and spoke in a soothing, baritone voice designed to de-escalate tension. He would visit the estate 3 times a week, bringing aged whiskey and reassuring smiles. But I started listening to the substance of those soothing conversations. Julian would lean against the marble island in the kitchen, swirling his amber drink, and casually drop highly volatile, entirely fabricated pieces of information. He would mention a rumor that the lead engineers were organizing a walkout, or that a rival tech firm had just stolen their proprietary code, or that the board was holding secret votes at midnight. He delivered these lies wrapped in velvet, masquerading as a loyal friend looking out for the boss. I watched Sterling's heart rate monitor spike on my tablet every single time Julian opened his mouth. Julian was not soothing the beast. He was systematically feeding its paranoia, keeping Sterling in a perpetual state of hypervigilant terror. Then there was Chloe. She moved through the estate in a cloud of expensive perfume, trailing a camera crew or a personal photographer like a royal procession. Her entire brand was built on being the tragic, beautiful angel desperately trying to save her tormented genius fiancé. It was a lucrative narrative, but her methods were deeply sinister. I observed her from the shadows of the second-floor mezzanine during one of her live stream sessions. Off camera, she would strategically rearrange his meticulously organized workspace, hide his blue light-blocking glasses, or loudly play abrasive music while he was in a state of deep focus. She would poke, prod, and annoy him with the precision of a surgeon until the exact second his temper flared. The moment his voice raised, the ring light clicked on. She would shrink back, tears instantly welling in her perfectly mascaraed eyes, whispering to her millions of viewers about how hard it was to love a man who was so brilliantly broken. She was manufacturing his madness for engagement metrics and public sympathy. My corporate espionage instincts, honed over a decade of dismantling hostile takeovers, flared to life. These were not the actions of a loyal executive and a loving partner. This was a coordinated psychological assassination. I stopped sleeping. I spent my nights tapping into the estate's encrypted network architecture. Since I already controlled the mainframes, it took me less than 48 hours to bypass the superficial security on Julian and Chloe's personal devices whenever they connected to the local wireless network. I deployed silent data trackers, cloned their cloud backups, and began piecing together their digital footprints. The truth I unearthed was far uglier than a simple betrayal. It was a masterpiece of corporate greed. Julian and Chloe were not just collaborating, they were sleeping together. I found hundreds of encrypted messages, hotel receipts paid through offshore dummy corporations, and time-stamped audio files of their clandestine meetings. I listened to a chilling recording captured on Chloe's phone in a downtown hotel suite. "We just need one more public meltdown," Julian had whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "Just one more major incident, and the board will beg us to lock him up for good." "I know," Chloe had replied, laughing softly. "I will make sure the cameras are rolling." The affair was merely the appetizer. The main course was a 60-page legal document sitting in a hidden folder on Julian's hard drive. It was a petition for a medical conservatorship. Their endgame was breathtaking in its cruelty. They did not want to oust Sterling from his own company. If he was simply fired, he would take his billions and walk away. They wanted to keep him. but they wanted him legally declared incompetent by continuously pushing him toward a complete psychotic break and ensuring Chloe documented every manufactured outburst on high-definition video. They were building an ironclad legal case to prove he was a danger to himself and others. Once a judge signed the conservatorship, Chloe, as his devoted fiancé, and Julian, as his trusted proxy, would gain total legal and financial control over his life, his shares, and his bank accounts. They were going to lock him in a gilded psychiatric facility and feast on the carcass of his empire. The urge to walk into the laboratory, hand the tablet to Sterling, and watch him obliterate them was tempting. It would be easy, but it would be messy, if I exposed them now. Julian had enough plausible deniability to spin a defense, and Chloe could easily play the victim of a jealous consultant. They were parasites deeply embedded in the host, and ripping them out prematurely could cause the patient to bleed to death. I closed my laptop and stared out into the dark estate. I would not say a single word. I would smile. I would pour them coffee, and I would let them believe they were winning. Meanwhile, I would meticulously construct a shadow dossier, verifying every wire transfer, every deleted text, and every fraudulent claim. They wanted to play a game of psychological destruction, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just invited a professional executioner to the table. I was going to let them dig their own graves, and when the time was right, I was going to bury them alive. The parasites could sense the temperature in the room changing. Julian and Chloe were not stupid, and as my behavioral conditioning slowly began to take effect, they noticed that their erratic, easily manipulated golden goose was becoming dangerously quiet. Sterling was spending more time coding in silence and less time throwing furniture. That meant I was a threat, and they decided it was time to eliminate me. On a Thursday morning, an explosive anonymous article dropped on a major Silicon Valley gossip blog. Within 2 hours, it had been picked up by mainstream financial news outlets. The headline accused an unnamed, highly paid corporate consultant of running a sophisticated psychological manipulation campaign against a vulnerable tech founder. The article alleged that I was isolating him, brainwashing him, and legally maneuvering to seize his assets for myself. It was a brilliantly executed smear campaign, planted perfectly to hit Sterling directly in his deepest, most primal fear, which was being used for his wealth. Sterling came crashing into the guest house like a localized hurricane. He did not bother knocking. He kicked the heavy oak door so hard it rebounded off the wall. His face twisted into a mask of absolute, venomous rage. He was clutching a tablet displaying the article, and he threw it directly at my feet. It clattered against the hardwood floor. "Is this it?" he roared, backing me against the edge of my work desk. "Is this your master plan? You march in here. You play the disciplined warden. You make me think you are the only honest person in my life. Also, you can dig your claws into my equity." He was towering over me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the frantic panic of a man who believed he had just been stabbed in the back by the only person he was starting to trust. He hurled every insult he could think of, calling me a gold digger, a parasite, a corporate vulture who was no better than the sycophants he despised. I let him scream. I did not flinch, and I did not defend myself. When he finally ran out of breath, panting and glaring at me with raw hatred, I reached into the locked drawer of my desk. I pulled out a thick black leather folder and slammed it directly into his chest. He reflexively grabbed it. "Open it!" I commanded, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper. Sterling hesitated, his anger momentarily stalled by my complete lack of fear. He flipped the folder open. Inside was a stack of high-resolution security stills I had pulled from his own private laboratory cameras, heavily magnified and time-stamped. Next to the photos was a heavily redacted toxicology analysis from the private medical clinic he visited for his annual checkups, cross-referenced with encrypted text messages I had pulled from Julian's phone. "You are not naturally going crazy, Sterling," I said, watching his eyes dart across the pages. "You are being poisoned." He froze. The color drained from his face entirely. "Look at the timestamp on the photos," I continued, stepping toward him. That is Julian, your loyal chief operating officer, standing at your wet bar 10 minutes before your massive meltdown during the third quarter board meeting. Look at his left hand. He is dropping 20 milligrams of a synthetic, prescription-grade amphetamine directly into your scotch. It is a highly potent stimulant designed to induce severe paranoia, hyperarousal, and aggression when mixed with alcohol. Sterling stared at the photograph, his mouth slightly open, his breathing suddenly shallow. Julian has been microdosing you before every major public appearance for the last 6 months, I stated ruthlessly, and Chloe has been standing by to film the chemical reaction. They leaked that article this morning because I am keeping you sober. I am keeping you calm, and I am ruining their timeline to have you declared legally insane. The folder slipped from his trembling hands and hit the floor. The anger completely vanished, replaced by a devastating, hollow realization. The 2 people he had protected, the 2 people he had showered with millions of dollars and defended against his own board of directors, were actively, maliciously trying to destroy his mind and steal his life. Sterling staggered backward, his knees hit the edge of the sofa, and he collapsed onto the cushions, putting his head in his hands. He did not cry. It was worse than crying. It was the absolute, silent shattering of a human soul. He sat there in the messy room, completely broken, a billionaire reduced to an empty shell by the crushing weight of ultimate betrayal. I walked over and sat down on the coffee table directly across from him. I did not reach out to touch his shoulder. I did not offer any soft, meaningless words of comfort. "Look at me," I said firmly. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were hollow, completely devoid of the arrogant fire that usually burned there. "People who want to steal your money will always smile at you," I told him, holding his gaze. "They will tell you exactly what you want to hear. They will coddle your ego while they pick your pockets. On this earth, the only people who actually want you to survive are the ones who are willing to stand in front of you and tell you when you are acting like a complete idiot." A long, heavy silence stretched between us. The air in the room fundamentally shifted. The toxic, combative dynamic we had established over the past month dissolved into nothing. Sterling looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw the one thing he had been searching for his entire adult life: loyalty. Not the kind of loyalty that is bought with stock options, but the kind of loyalty that is forged in the trenches. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face hardening into something sharp and dangerous. The frightened, chaotic boy was gone. The genius was waking up. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice dead flat. An unspoken contract was signed in that exact moment. I leaned in, matching his intensity. "We give them exactly what they want," I replied, a dark smile playing on my lips. "We put on a show. From the moment you walk out that door, you go back to being the unhinged, out-of-control monster they think you are. You scream, you break things, and you let Julian feed you his lies. And I will play the defeated, terrified consultant who has lost complete control of her client." Sterling nodded slowly, absorbing the strategy. There was no sappy romance blossoming between us, no cinematic embrace. It was something far more powerful. It was the absolute, magnetic synergy of 2 apex predators who had just agreed to hunt together. We were going to build a trap, and we were going to let the parasites walk right into it. The ballroom of the Grand Saint. Regis Hotel was a suffocating sea of black tuxedos, diamond necklaces, and ruthless ambition. The annual shareholder gala was designed to be a celebration of corporate dominance, but tonight, the atmosphere in the cavernous, chandelier-lit hall was thick with the scent of an impending execution. Julian and Chloe had set their final, inescapable trap, perfectly timed to force the board of directors into a corner. Outside the velvet ropes, the flashbulbs of 50 different press cameras fired in a blinding strobe effect. Chloe stood at the center of the media circus, wearing a pristine, angelic white designer gown that contrasted perfectly with her heavily rehearsed tears. She dabbed her eyes with a silk tissue, whispering to the hungry reporters about the sheer terror of living behind closed doors with a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. She painted herself as the ultimate martyr, a devoted partner who had sacrificed her own youth trying to save a monster, only to be met with violence and paranoia. Inside the grand ballroom, the executioner was preparing his blade. Julian stood on the main stage, projecting an aura of heavy, sorrowful reluctance. The 12 members of the board of directors sat in the front row, their faces pale and tight. Julian dimmed the crystal chandeliers and directed everyone's attention to the massive, ultra-high definition screen spanning the wall behind him. "It brings me no joy to show you this," Julian said, his baritone voice echoing through the silent room, thick with manufactured grief. "But we have a fiduciary duty to protect this company, and more importantly, a moral duty to protect our employees from a man who is no longer in control of his own mind." He clicked a remote, and the screen roared to life. It was a masterfully edited compilation of security footage and audio clips. It showed Sterling kicking a heavy oak door, throwing a tablet across the room, and screaming aggressively at the empty air. The footage was completely stripped of context, digitally spliced together to make him look like a deranged, feral animal foaming at the mouth. To the uninitiated audience, it was horrifying. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. The outrage in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating wave of judgment. I stood alone in the back corner of the ballroom, leaning casually against a marble pillar. Every few minutes, a board member or a wealthy investor would cast a glance in my direction. Their eyes were filled with absolute contempt. In their minds, I was the highly paid, useless corporate consultant who had failed spectacularly. I was the accomplice to a madman, the woman who had watched the empire burn and done absolutely nothing to stop it. I held my glass of sparkling water, ignoring their glares, watching the seconds tick by on the grandfather clock near the exit. On stage, the chairman of the board stood up, looking physically sick. He pulled a thick leather-bound folder from his briefcase and placed it on the podium. It was the emergency transfer of power, a legally binding document that would strip Sterling of his voting rights, place him under an involuntary psychiatric hold, and name Julian as the interim chief executive officer with total control over the assets. "Given the severity of this evidence," the chairman announced, his voice trembling slightly, "the board has voted unanimously to execute the contingency clause. Julian, if you will please sign." Julian stepped forward. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a gold fountain pen. I could see the faint, victorious tremor in his fingers. He had won. He was exactly 3 seconds away from stealing a multi-billion-dollar empire. He uncapped the pen and lowered it toward the thick parchment. "I would not sign that if I were you, Julian." The voice cut through the cavernous ballroom like a perfectly thrown throwing knife. It was not a scream. It was not a manic yell. It was cold, deep, and terrifyingly calm. Every single head in the room snapped toward the side entrance of the stage. Sterling Vance stepped out of the shadows. He was not disheveled. He was not manic. He was wearing a meticulously tailored, charcoal gray suit. His hair was perfectly styled. His posture was rigid, commanding, and radiating an overwhelming aura of absolute authority. He walked toward the podium with slow, measured steps, his eyes locked onto Julian with the lethal focus of a sniper. The chaotic, frightened boy was dead. The man standing on that stage was a predator at the top of the food chain. Julian froze, the gold pen hovering a fraction of an inch above the paper. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. Chloe, who had just walked into the ballroom to witness her victory, stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hand flying to her mouth in shock. I pushed off the marble pillar and smiled. It was a vicious, predatory smile. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and typed a single, one-word message to my technical team waiting in the server room. "Execute." Behind Julian, the giant, ultra-high-definition screen abruptly cut off. The horrific, spliced video vanished, replaced by a wall of absolute piercing black. The sudden darkness on the stage signaled that the meticulously crafted illusion had just shattered. The ballroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The trap was sprung, but the parasites were the ones standing inside it. I stepped out from the shadow of the marble pillar and walked directly to the audio engineering booth at the back of the ballroom. The technician, who was secretly on my payroll, immediately stepped aside. I leaned over the master control board and flipped the primary audio switch. The suffocating silence of the room was suddenly shattered by a voice echoing from the surround sound speakers. "We just need one more public meltdown." It was Julian's voice, crisp and undeniable, recorded in that downtown hotel suite. "I know," Chloe's voice replied, followed by a soft, sinister laugh. "I will make sure the cameras are rolling." Julian spun around on the stage, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He frantically waved at the audio booth, shouting for someone to cut the feed, but I had already locked the console. I tapped a single key on my laptop. The massive screen behind Julian illuminated again, but this time, it was not playing a manipulated video, it was projecting a live feed of my shadow dossier. Hundreds of high-definition documents flooded the screen. Bank statements from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Encrypted emails sent from Julian to the chief executive officer of their biggest rival, negotiating the sale of Sterling's proprietary algorithms for $50 million. I highlighted the wire transfers, showing exactly how much corporate money Julian had embezzled to fund his illicit affair with his boss's fiancée. Every single number, every single damning transaction, was blown up to 30 feet tall for the entire board of directors to read. Chloe panicked. She realized the narrative was collapsing, so she desperately tried to salvage her brand. She ran toward the front of the stage, tears streaming down her face, and grabbed a microphone. "He made me do it," she sobbed, pointing a manicured finger at Julian. "Julian manipulated me. He forced me to go along with this. I was scared for my life." I smiled. It was the moment I had been waiting for. I pressed the final button on my keyboard. The financial documents vanished from the screen, replaced by a crystal clear, time-stamped security video from the master bathroom of the estate. The footage showed Chloe, perfectly alone, casually humming a tune as she crushed a highly potent synthetic amphetamine into a fine powder. She then meticulously funneled the drug directly into Sterling's daily prescription vitamin capsules, sealed the bottle, and placed it back on his sink. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom, followed by a dead, horrified silence. The board members in the front row physically recoiled from the stage. The chairman of the board picked up the emergency transfer of power document, looked at Julian with utter disgust, and ripped the thick parchment completely in half. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 12 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed on the back marched down the center aisle. I had spent the last 72 hours handing my fully compiled, undeniable evidence directly to a very eager federal prosecutor. The agents flanked the stage. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping around Julian's and Chloe's wrists echoed loudly over the microphones. They were dragged off the stage, screaming and crying, escorted directly out the front doors into the blinding flashes of the press cameras they had so carefully orchestrated. Sterling stood at the podium. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He looked out over the stunned crowd of elites, projecting the absolute calm of a man who had just reclaimed his kingdom. "The rot has been surgically removed from this company," Sterling announced, his voice steady and commanding. Then, he turned his head and looked directly at me across the vast room. "The woman standing in the back of this hall, Riley Hicks, is not just a consultant. She is the most formidable strategic partner I will ever have in this lifetime. She is the only person who looked at $1 billion and chose the truth instead." 6 months later, the corporate world barely recognized him. Sterling Vance became the ultimate version of a leader. He was cold, sharp, and relentlessly focused. He fired every remaining sycophant in the building and replaced them with brilliant, hard-working engineers who actually challenged him. He never threw another object. He never raised his voice in anger. And most importantly, he never once forgot to say the word please. Exactly 1 year to the day after I signed the initial contract, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my bank. $1 billion in unrestricted stock options had fully vested and transferred into my accounts. I was officially a billionaire. I stood in the glass-walled guest house, zipping up my 2 matte black suitcases. The hunt was over. The target was cured. My job was done. I grabbed the handle of my luggage and turned toward the door, only to find Sterling standing in the doorway. He was not wearing a tailored suit today. He was wearing a simple gray hoodie and jeans, looking like the brilliant, focused engineer he was always meant to be. He did not block my path with the arrogance of a billionaire. He stood there with the quiet sincerity of a man who had finally figured out what actually mattered. He held out a thick leather folder. "I know you told me you do not have a family, Riley," he said, his voice quiet but incredibly firm. "But you built one here. Do not leave." I slowly let go of my suitcase and opened the folder. It was not a consulting contract. It was an operating agreement, naming me the permanent co-founder of the entire empire, with full executive authority. He was handing me half of his kingdom, simply because he trusted me with his life. I closed the folder. I looked up, met his intense, brilliant eyes, and did not blink. For the first time since I arrived at the estate, a genuine, warm smile crossed my face. I nodded my head, accepting the offer. The hunt had ended perfectly, and I was finally home. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are all listening from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you felt today's story was engaging and well told, please remember that this channel has been demonetized, and we will not be uploading any new videos here on YouTube in the near future. We are transitioning our entire operation over to Patreon. Please help us keep these stories alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can listen to the absolute best, longest, and most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can scan the QR code currently on your screen, or simply use the link provided in the description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and take care.